Welcome back to Derisky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. And that's right, Emily, we are back for a second season.
Yeah, now that it's almost Halloween, I guess we have to come back from our summer hiatus, Geoff.
I think so. The leaves are changing, the temperature is dropping. Time to shake off that summer hiatus. Derisky Business is back.
It is, and we have got a fantastic slate of episodes planned for our second season. We'll be talking, no surprise, about U.S.-China trade negotiations, see how that's going, the shifting AI export policy, what the Supreme Court thinks about Trump's trade policy.
And I'm guessing there just might be some new tariffs to cover as well. We'll see.
Maybe some tariffs, we'll see. But for the first episode of our second season, we're super excited to talk to Peter Harrell. We'll be talking to him about an idea that we've been working on and he's been working on, which is how to think about bringing economic security priorities like export controls and investment screening and defensive tariffs. How do we bring that all into what's a traditional trade agreement? Should we? How would we do it? Etc. So Peter, as folks may know, is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and served in the White House in the Biden administration as the Senior Director for International Economics. He is also the host of the second best podcast on these issues called Security Economics.
That's right. So if any of our listeners are not already subscribed to Security Economics, do go check it out. It's a really fantastic podcast. Certainly if you are interested in de-risky business, we think they'll have lots of interest in security economics as well. I really enjoyed this discussion with Peter. We had a good chance to get into the weeds on what would it actually mean to bring economic security tools into the text of a trade agreement. I think this is an idea that's sort of out there floating around, but not that many people have done the kind of actual hard thinking of what would it mean to write the text down. And so we get really into those details in this discussion.
Yeah, it's out there floating around because we've been floating it around. But we'll talk to him about how that might work in some of the framework political deals that we've seen President Trump strike in the Oval Office, how it might work in the North America context with the review of USMCA, some really interesting tidbits that came out recently with the president's tour through Asia, looking at Malaysia and Cambodia and what economic security means in those contexts. So a lot for us to dig into.
That's right. So we hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we will be back soon with another episode of De-Risky Business.
And as always, you can reach us at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. And you can also find the pod on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is supported in part by Amazon and through general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program.
All right, welcome back to a special joint episode of the podcast here. We're delighted to be joined by Peter Harrell. Peter, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself on your joint podcast here?
Great. Well, I'm the host of the Security Economics podcast. I'm also, as of about 2 weeks ago, a visiting scholar at Georgetown Law School. And great to be doing this with you guys.
Great. Well, we want to have Peter on to dig into an issue that Emily and I have been doing a lot of thinking about. Peter's also been doing his own work on, which is really where does the intersection of economic security and the global trading regime go? And so something we've been writing about in Foreign Affairs and other places. Tons of interesting work. Peter's been doing a bunch of work on this, kind of particularly in the context of using trade agreements to counter China. So we thought good time to bring us all together to discuss this. And maybe, a useful sort of opening framing question is, what are we really talking about here when we're talking about economic security and trade agreements?
Yeah, and there's a few things we should break down there, which is what are we talking about when we're talking about economic security? What are we talking about when we talk about what's a trade deal? We're doing all sorts of interesting things with trade deals, quote unquote, these days. What do we actually mean when we say we should bring economic security into a trade agreement? And so we're thinking about all of that. So we have a working definition, but Peter can tell us if this is right or wrong, of economic security, which is generally this idea that it's a national security risk that arises out of otherwise ordinary economic activity. So there's a lot of commercial activity around the world. Most of it is fantastic, but sometimes there is that activity that raises a risk because it involves some sort of strategic interest of the US. But Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Emily, I think that is very much like the right conceptual answer. We're talking about the tools and things that we are using to deal with risks where the market, sort of national security risks that the market isn't going to solve. And then if you think sort of concretely for our audiences, we're talking about things from a US perspective sound like Scythius. How would you embed investment screening in trade agreements? Sound like export controls and embedding. Should you or how could you embed export control discussions in trade agreements? A whole range of other things, as well as I think a part of tariffs, right? Because a piece of this is how do we keep Chinese content out of U.S. supply chains and out of allied supply chains when that Chinese content potentially has a national security risk to it, such that we want to address because of the national security element, not because of the economic elements.
Yeah, and obviously we're having this conversation against the backdrop of an administration that is using national security justifications for a whole range of trade policies and kind of tariffs on all of our different trade partners. I think it is worth sort of digging in a little bit that, I think we can be skeptical of some of the national security justifications of tariffs on, furniture or whatever else it may be that the administration is looking at, sort of textiles. But, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are real, genuine national security risks. The sort of steel sector is critical to U.S. national security. If we let our trade policy evolve in a way such that the United States has zero capacity for domestic steel production, that would be a genuine national security risk.
Yeah, I like to point out two of the more recent examples just to show how much this conversation has shifted in like the 15 years I've been working on economic security issues, right? So it's very easy to think about a chip that goes into a military platform or a fighter jet. Like obviously that's like national security related. We're now having all this conversation around autos. And if you remember in the first Trump administration, there actually was an effort to do a national security investigation into the effect of auto imports. And at the time, it didn't get off the ground because there was just too much contention about whether that was really a national security risk or not. But now, like, no one's arguing that as much, either because we just have this broader buy-in on the idea that auto manufacturing is important for industrial capacity, important for domestic manufacturing, that writ large matters for our industrial base and therefore for our national security, or it's just so economically significant that it's worthy of protection. But it's interesting to see how that conversation has just shifted so much from the first Trump administration. But I will say there are limits, which brings me to my new favorite bit, which is the 232 investigations, the national security investigations into lumber and related products, which includes kitchen cabinets. So we are not like totally at the point yet of putting everything and the kitchen sink into our definition of national security. But with kitchen cabinets, we are getting very close.
If it's a steel kitchen sink, I'm pretty sure it's already covered by the steel derivative products.
Multiple different 232 investigations. Yes.
Layers upon layers. So let's talk about the next question, just to level set, which is like, what is a trade deal these days, right? So I spent time at USTR, which is a building filled with people who are used to negotiating thousands of pages of highly negotiated, legally scrubbed text. But it's not really what we're talking about for the most part today when we're talking about a trade deal, right?
So it's interesting on that because I think that as you say, I mean, and Emily, coming up through the State Department back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and seeing some of the effort to negotiate the trade deal with Korea and ratify the trade deal with Korea, and then the ill-fated TPP negotiations. I think we have an idea of a trade deal that is, hundreds of pages of detailed text that really is working to establish tariff rates, sure, but tariff rates had almost become secondary in a lot of these trade deals. I mean, yes, there were tariff reductions, but an awful lot of the purpose of these deals was to come up with, joint rules on how to deal with subsidies, to come up with anti-corruption standards, to come up with, lots of detailed rules about sort of cooperation on sanitary and phytosanitary and food safety, kinds of standards. You have these very long and textually rich documents that get into a tremendous amount of, commitments the countries are making on sort of how they will govern, not just literally like the movement of goods from port in country A to port in country B, but in some sense, like how they're going to manage their economies adjacent to trade and ways to have more open economies. And, I think we may, with the Trump administration, see a couple of trade deals that will eventually look like that. I think it'll be interesting with their USMCA review, and if they want to have a serious renegotiation of the USMCA, right? That's something that'll may look trade deal like. But a lot of what we've seen so far are these like 2 to 4 page, what I think call a sort of trade MOUs, where we from the U.S. side have been agreeing to cap tariff rates at certain levels, and the other trading partners have agreed to kind of, lower some tariff rates and maybe also make some various other concessions to the United States, but are really so far pretty short and high level. And the question is going to be how many of these can actually get turned into what we think of as trade agreements.
Yeah, it's been funny watching the trade agreements come out. I feel you get kind of, the Truth Social post of, US and Korea have a trade deal, and then maybe a week later you get a press release or something, and then maybe a few weeks after that you get a sort of 5-page trade framework agreement. But again, all of this is at a much higher level of abstraction than the big kind of, 1,000-long page TPP type deals we used to be doing. And so I think there's a real question, kind of, is this just what trade policy is now, and kind of what does that mean going forward? Again, almost none of these are legally binding. Almost none of them, certainly kind of what's been put out there so far, has any intention of going through Congress. So is this just what trade policy is now, or is this a sort of bridge towards some of those bigger, longer, more binding agreements, which I think is an open question.
Yeah. Peter, I want to pick up on a phrase you used, which is using trade deals to manage issues adjacent to trade. Because I actually think that's a good segue into kind of what we wanted to talk about, which is how do we think about economic security coming into trade agreements? And it's worth noting, like traditionally, when we think about instruments like export controls or investment screening, stuff that really touches on core national security interests that a government might have, trade agreements usually are like, that's none of my business. That is all carved out. It's a sovereign issue, and we're just not going to talk about it. But we do see in other contexts that trade agreements have been flexible. They do incorporate new issues, right? Like, so you saw the kind of increasing incorporation of environment and labor concerns over time. You saw digital trade become a big thing once we actually had digital economies. And I do think there's this moment now that we've all been talking about, like, is this that moment for economic security where there's just so much happening in that space that impacts trade and investment that it no longer makes sense to kind of treat these in completely different silos? Like, if we were to actually kind of bring them together, what does that look like?
I think there's some interesting potential analogies, Emily, if you look at how the U.S. thought about embedding some of these other issues like anti-corruption in trade agreements sort of 15, 20 years ago, because if you look at the way the U.S. government and our trading partners thought about embedding something like anti-corruption in a potential trade agreement like the TPP, the idea was basically that you would get all governments, in the case of TPP, if we're doing this multilaterally, or both on a bilateral basis, to make legally binding commitments about the laws and practices they would adopt at home for something like corruption. So they would governments would commit to adopting anti-bribery laws domestically, and governments would commit to publishing transparently government procurement bids, right? On the idea that if it's all published publicly and transparently, it's harder to actually have corrupt bidding around those bids. So it's not actually that sort of, the U.S. government is getting some kind of right to, extra right to prosecute people in Thailand for being corrupt, or vice versa. It's really about how the governments are committing to adopt certain domestic laws that would, try to raise the floor and reduce corruption within the different markets that are joining the trade agreement. And I think that's like an interesting, potential model as you think about economic security. But it's interesting though, because if you talk about the history of economic security and trade agreements, as you say, Emily, like historically on the trade deal front, all this stuff has been carved out. But if you look back at the Cold War, of course, we had COCOM. We actually had very close cooperation with our kind of NATO allies on export controls, where actually, we had effectively a right to veto exports from many of our allies to the Eastern Bloc and vice versa, that was covering at the time something like more than 50% of high-tech goods being exported from the relevant market. So there is like an interesting precedent for quite close cooperation on what we would all think of as sort of an economic security, national security measure today in today's parlance, but that was entirely separate from the GATT trading system and the other trading deals we had at the time.
Yeah, I think somewhat you can carry that analogy forward if you look at, the Biden era controls on Chinese semiconductors, where sort of lots of cooperation discussion between the US, Netherlands, the Japanese in particular, sort of trying to align systems there. But again, all done outside of the context of any trade agreement. Sort of the trade system continues to say, this is a national security exception, kind of, we have nothing to speak to this. And I think kind of, a big question Emily and I have been thinking about in this work is sort of, that really just doesn't seem fit for purpose anymore when governments are so concerned with economic security priorities. So how can you kind of start to bring some of this norm building around economic security into the trade regime, given this is a top priority and is kind of affecting more and more trade and investment flows around the world?
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that. I mean, there's a couple other points that are worth making here. Like we, broadly speaking, are moving away from any sort of trade arrangements that are global in nature, right? Like the direction of travel is clearly away from the World Trade Organization. And if we're lucky, towards smaller groupings, whether it's club-based groupings or just bilateral arrangements, you can do a lot more on security issues in that context, because you're never going to negotiate that with China in the framework that we're talking about. I also think there's a kind of an urgency and momentum question that matters a lot. Like, we've been historically dealing with the economic security and the trade issues in separate tracks, and we've been wanting to push, from a US perspective, partners to do more on economic security. And it always seems like they're never moving quite far enough or fast enough as we would like them to. And so, is there a way to kind of leverage the heft and momentum of a trade agreement or a trade deal to kind of create more deal space, create more incentives, maybe some sticks, who knows, like to kind of push that cooperation forward with the urgency that we kind of think it needs?
I think this is where, in some ways, Trump's very aggressive trade policy, his, very strong willingness to raise tariff rates, does give the U.S. some potentially some leverage. Because, if I look back at the Biden administration, I think one reason the Biden administration wanted to keep the economic security issues separate from the trade issues is that the Biden administration, thought, well, we're not sure we want to lower tariffs anyway, right? We already had fairly low tariffs, not sure we want to lower tariffs anyway. So, not sure we're willing to trade away 3 or 5% tariffs for economic security measures. Trump seems willing to trade, he's going to keep 15% tariffs, but maybe he's willing to trade 20% tariffs down to 15 for economic security measures, right? So he has more bargaining room. And then the other concern is just, if I think for the Biden administration, if they had trade talks, it's sort of, well, those tend to be historically have been quite slow. And if you're trying to line up, allied action on export controls on semiconductors, the Biden administration's approach was, well, it's going to be faster to just go work with the Dutch and work with the Japanese kind of trilaterally, rather than having this embedded in some trade talk that might take 2 or 3 years to get through. I think the Trump administration is seeing things move much more quickly there. So it opens up potentially trade deals as kind of a tactically more attractive avenue than I think they were a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe that's probably a good pivot into sort of what has the Trump administration actually been doing on this front. Because we do think there has been, some action here. So certainly if you go back and look at the, day one America First trade policy memo from 9 months ago, there's a real kind of focus on linking trade policy and national security policy, a real focus on saying, we see these things connected. We are going to sort of talk about them in the same breadth and with partners at the same time. And then, as we've obviously seen all of the different kind of trade policy machinations that have happened since then, if you do go look at the kind of trade framework agreements, the sort of 2-page versions that are coming out, you definitely see kind of signposts of, we want to cooperate on economic security. We're going to sort of do more on export controls. We're going to do more on investment security. I'll say, so far all this has been at a very vague and high level point. I think it's kind of really unclear if there's plans to actually make that more concrete, but there's definitely, at least some breadcrumbs there for those of us that are kind of interested in this topic to kind of point to and say, look, there's something happening here.
Yeah, although, what do we make of those breadcrumbs, right? Like, we could talk about that, because there's not a lot in those specific little, 20 words that we're reading a lot into right now. And like, you could read into it that this is something we should take with our typical counter China lens on, right? That like, oh, great, they're saying economic security. For years, we've used that term to mean counter China coordination on investment screening and export controls and tariffs and all that good stuff. You could also take that to mean all the other ways that the Trump administration is currently thinking about economic security. So there's a very cynical interpretation of that that's like, this is about US economic security, and these agreements are really about how we're all going to cooperate to get as much manufacturing and investment in the United States as possible, right? It's a very different lens to look at the concept of economic security through.
No, and we've certainly seen the Trump administration pushing hard on that last point. I mean, with these investment deals of Japanese money, maybe eventually coming into the United States. So I agree with you. You could read this. You could read this either way. That's it. On the more what I think of with the national security hat on economic security. We have seen a couple of different specific data points and then a couple that are more general. And so just to throw out a couple that stood out to me and then interested in what has stood out to you. So the one that seems most concrete to me was in the US EU deal, where there is an explicit agreement that the US will loosen export controls on advanced AI chips to the EU in exchange for the EU adopting export controls of its own, TBD. So yeah, it's not very, doesn't specify exactly what chips or exactly what that would be, but I think against the backdrop of all the debates we've been having on AI chip export controls, you kind of have a sense, at least conceptually, what they're talking about there. Then if you look back at the UK deal, there were some, references to ownership of critical sectors like steel and things like that. And the UK was obviously trying to get the Chinese out of a particular steel company. So there seems to be in that deal some reference to ownership. And then you have in some of the deals in Asia more sort of what I think of as general commitments to cooperate on economic security issues. And so I do think it remains kind of TBD on how deep and specific and what these commitments are actually going to materialize to be.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess a couple questions that stood out to me. So one, certainly the US-EU chip one, I think will be interesting to look at. And I do think it's interesting to think through, is that a kind of breadcrumb, as it were, for sort of a new global system or a new sort of way we are thinking about these chip controls? Or is this going to be sort of a one-off deal with the EU that may be very different from whatever we're doing with the Gulf, from whatever we're doing with sort of other countries? I think that's a kind of big outstanding question. Then, the other area that jumped out to me, and this is, not new per se to the Trump team, but you mentioned steel. Obviously, there is a focus on the steel tariffs, and again, I think this does go to sort of national security tariff side here, where I think, look, the ultimate answer on national security steel tariffs has been pretty clear for some time, of trying to get kind of a steel club of like-minded countries that all have common tariffs on non-market, aka China, sort of overcapacity in the sector, in return for low, if not zero, tariffs amongst themselves. I think it's clear that's the sort of the basis of what the Trump team is negotiating with lots of different countries. Again, still very TBD how far they will go. I think still TBD, how much is the Trump administration willing to talk about this in sort of club terms versus, still very much focused on just the U.S. domestic scene, but also, a kind of carrot that can be traded off with other partners. But I think that's an area where, alignment with like-minded partners on a national security issue on tariffs, it seems very obvious to me, and we'll see if we can get it done.
Still TBD is a good tagline for most of what
Yeah.
And I do think, Geoff, to your your point, like steel is an interesting one because I agree. I think any of us who think about this from a national security perspective or from a kind of broad U.S. economic perspective very much would agree. Like there's kind of an obvious solution there. On the other hand, the Trump administration, I think, is pretty adamantly attached to the idea that U.S. steel mills operate at 80% capacity or above, right? They've defined that in their investigation as like the objective, and they seem very, very committed to that. And so I'm not convinced they are prepared to accept any arrangement, even among allies, unless there's some safety valve such that they can turn it all off if U.S. capacity utilization falls below 80%, because that just seems to be their actual objective here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's playing out in the autos North America context as well, right? Where like there's clearly an argument for an integrated North American autos market. That is in fact what we currently have. But they seem pretty insensitive at this point to, for example, like plant closures in Canada and broader concerns about just forcing all of that content that goes into a North American car to actually be U.S. content. So well, maybe should we be optimistic for a minute and kind of put our own lens on this question? So forget what the Trump administration is going to do. There is kind of maybe it's a more technical conversation, but maybe not, right? Like, of how would you actually go about this integration of economic security into trade agreements if you are really more thinking about kind of a counter China lens and kind of thinking about something that is like actually negotiated and put down on paper with partners. And Peter, you've written about this. You've actually managed to publish. Geoff and I have written about this. We have not managed to publish it yet, but we will. Kudos to you. But kind of how are you thinking about this question of like, how do you actually negotiate around this, and kind of where do you draw the line, right? Because there's always going to be sensitivities when you are negotiating around something that is inherently based on an underlying security issue. So how much can we use agreements to really kind of push alignment and strengthen alignment while recognizing that some stuff is always going to be a matter of sovereignty?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I guess when I've been writing about this and thinking about this, I've kind of been, broadly speaking, dividing the world into two buckets, or dividing this part of the deals into two buckets. One of which is what we were just talking about on steel. Like, how could you, for imports of goods or trading of goods, where you want to make sure either the U.S. alone or, from my perspective, ideally U.S. with allies, is not dependent on China or other kind of adversarial countries, how can you set up a kind of common external tariff among like-minded countries and use a trade deal to coordinate that common external tariff? And there, in some sense, like trade deals have always worked on cooperation on tariff. They've tended over the last couple of decades to cooperate on reducing tariffs bilaterally rather than raising tariffs on third countries. But there's a lot of precedent and practice on how trade deals deal with tariffs. And you could either do sort of actually agreed common rates. You could kind of offer mutual recognition of each other's anti-dumping and countervailing duty findings to kind of make it easier to rely on each other's findings. You can have sort of more, consultative mechanisms where the countries, if there's imports coming in from third countries, consult on it. But there, sort of sets of things you can do to coordinate external tariffs that we can unpack. And then there is sort of, well, how would a trade deal cooperate on something like investment screening, something like export controls, and there, when I think about this, I look to the way past trade deals have dealt with issues such as anti-corruption or the TPP. There was a lot of thinking on how it could deal with currency valuation issues, which is more of a framework where the countries, the parties to the trade deal, are collectively agreeing to adopt domestic laws that raise their standards in these issues. So you take anti-corruption, typically what will happen in anti-corruption provisions of trade deals is countries will agree, we will both adopt laws criminalizing bribery, we will prosecute bribery, we'll have, open and transparent bidding procedures, things that reduce corruption. And the countries then kind of have to implement those laws domestically. And you could envision something similar for investment screening or export controls, where you sort of countries are agreeing to adopt strong investment screening laws domestically. They're agreeing to adopt strong export controls domestically. And then, you have some kind of cooperation mechanism when particular cases that, potentially impact those laws come through the system. So that's sort of how I've been thinking about this. But I know you guys have also been, you haven't published it yet, but I know you guys have actually written quite a bit on this for forthcoming publication.
Yeah, we're in stealth mode. It's very, it will be coming out soon. So we both have a lot of thoughts on this. Maybe like to start on this question of the common tariffs. I mean, so I think we're largely aligned with what you're thinking, Peter, but there's a piece that's worth just foot stomping a little bit, which is that it's a common external tariff and elimination of internal tariffs, right? Like that's kind of the quid pro quo that needs to happen in order to make that work, because why would you agree with another country on the external common tariff if they're also tariffing you? Then you get double tariffs, right? So like that doesn't really make any sense, like either economically or politically. And like there's this kind of question of like, okay, you can construct the tool, but then like, do you have enough scale within the internal market to actually have a competitive sector and to avoid kind of the downsides, the potential downsides of quote unquote protectionism, right? So I think that bargain is really important. And that's how we've been trying to think about, if you're drafting, for example, model text, how do you actually make that explicit? And like, as you said, there's a bunch of different kind of coordination mechanisms you can think about and how you structure that. But I think that basic political bargain is kind of where you need to start. But Geoff, you have thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on that political bargain point, yeah, sort of very much agree that that's going to have to be part of the quid pro quo, and certainly sort of, maybe get into a bit more sort of talking to other governments and how they are thinking about this. But it's very obvious at the moment that sort of what other governments want is some assurance on their access to the U.S. market, and so kind of that is what they are going to be looking for, sort of in exchange for any signing on to kind of higher common external tariffs routed to China. But I do think there's also kind of broader point here, which is that if you are going to have that deeper integration among markets, that sort of necessitates more of the cooperation relative to foreign adversaries as well, right? So like thinking about, Peter, I really like the idea of sort of mutual recognitions of ADCV and stuff like that, because it's like part of that is saying like, look, if we have a integrated market because of our trade framework agreement anyways, then, if something is having an anti-dumping effect in your market, there's quite a good chance it's impacting my market as well, because by definition, we've sort of set up this deep integration, and therefore we also need to be prepared to sort of quickly act on those type of anti-dumping. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then maybe just sort of a bit more on the, investment screen export control side as well. Again, I think at a high level, we're thinking of it quite similarly, that this would be a sort of domestic commitment that you'd be putting into an international agreement. And again, maybe it's worth being a bit clear here, certainly on the export, well, sort of on the broader economic security toolkit here, the United States toolkit is far more developed than even most of our kind of advanced partners here. So, the United States' ability to implement export controls on sort of individual entities, to do it outside of the context of sort of multilateral export control regimes, far more developed than other countries. Similarly, our kind of investment screening tool, again, most of our kind of European partners have stood up investment screening tools over the last year or so, often under sort of U.S. pressure, but there's still a few that are worth pushing on, and there's still a lot of questions about kind of the exact jurisdiction and sort of, adequate resourcing of these different tools. So I think there's a lot that the United States would like to see other countries do here. So again, the idea is to sort of get them to stand up their domestic tools, and it's also worth noting, I think there's also a kind of quid pro quo piece of it here, which is that we do want to look for, how can we put some carrots on the table in terms of sort of fast track licensing approvals of investment screening among allies. And, we were just sort of talking in the EU context of, ensuring sort of, export controls on advanced chips are not getting in the way of US-EU trade on these issues. So you can build that in more systematically to say, again, if you are in the club, if you have your own kind of effective export control regime and are implementing it effectively, you then get some benefits of kind of freer, more open trade on those controlled products amongst the parties that have signed on to it.
Yeah, that's exactly on the kind of the standards based approach to kind of an economic security club, right? If you can kind of characterize it like that, we need those other countries to kind of level up on the investment security or economic security tools, because we don't want to just push the risk out to them, right? And we've been saying this for decades, and we're still kind of unsatisfied with how fast they're moving. So one thing we're really interested in is like, what is this deal space, right? If we are making asks of you, what are we providing to you in return? And so part of that's what Geoff said in terms of, okay, we want you to set up the investment screening, so we're going to give you fast track. But there's another dimension of that, which is that there's a way that all of these economic security tools then just become a lot more barriers to trade and investment. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen, right? So just like as a tangible benefit, but also as a practical effect of just, if you put up more barriers, you could end up with more barriers, oddly enough. How do you prevent that? Yeah.
It is interesting because we do see the Trump administration, even as it erects barriers in some areas, thinking about this. I mean, earlier this year, they put out this memorandum on America First investment, which I at least haven't seen a ton of implementation on, although I understand that they are, talking internally about implementation. But a lot of, if you go back to read this memorandum on American First investment, a lot of it is about toughening up restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States. But it also talks quite a bit about trying to get the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department to be more open to foreign investment from allied countries here, including on the Treasury side, potentially greater use of the CFIUS whitelist, where you can really actually streamline CFIUS filings for allied investment. And then on the commerce side, I think it's a little more tactical of kind of white glove service where they come and help you invest in the U.S. The U.S. government has never done that all that well historically. Some state governments do that very well. I've never seen the federal government do that very well. But, it's an idea that's been around for a long time, and maybe they'll finally crack that code.
Yeah, the U.S. government has always sort of, put on trade shows and stuff, but like, you can go to other governments and see they've got investment promotion agencies that are very slick and very good, and kind of, I think the Trump administration has a view of, they like foreign investment. They want this $600 billion from Japan, $350 billion from Korea coming in. I think there's a question of sort of, how are they thinking about those massive, big foreign investments, specifically into strategic sectors? They're going to need a way to think about this sort of fast track problem. And, what Emily said was exactly right. You kind of, as we are putting up more barriers and recognizing we need to be thinking about national security issues in investment and trade transactions, you want to make sure that's not kind of killing the golden goose, as it were, and kind of squeezing out all transactions altogether.
Yeah. And we've all, I know, been talking to various counterparts in foreign capitals and kind of testing some of these ideas, right? We're thinking a lot about how, whether the Trump administration would implement this. And there are some signs that, particularly on investment, that they would. But they need someone else to agree to it. And so maybe it's worth just kind of doing a quick tour around the world, like who's up for this, right? Like we've been thinking about this a lot in the North America context, which has its own kind of specific interests. There's certainly a conversation that's been ongoing in Europe, in Tokyo, in Australia. And I think each of those capitals are responding a little bit differently to this idea, although there's potentially a common thread here, which is like, well, sure, we're up for this, but like, is the US up for it?
Yeah, and I do think that's an important topic that we should talk about. I mean, when I talk to, I tend to talk more to European officials and North Asian officials, and Japanese and Korean officials, and occasionally Australians. And what I would say, the tone of those discussions. So first of all, I think, there is more receptivity on all of these issues than there was a couple of years ago, because these governments are all feeling the challenges from China more directly than they were a couple of years ago. That's because of Chinese overcapacity in critical industries is now hitting their markets and not just ours. It's because they see China, buying up strategic, whether it's mining assets or, robotics, or they see China buying up some of these companies. It's interesting, I think, right now, like this week, with the way China has retaliated for U.S. action on export controls in part by restricting exports from China to Europe of semiconductors made by this company called Nexperia. I think that is focusing the mind more of, we actually shouldn't be reliant on China for a bunch of these critical goods. So like there's a fertile ground out there that I think the Trump administration can go and plow to build support for a bunch of these common provisions. But as you said earlier, Emily, like the U.S. is going to have to, in many cases, be willing to give a little something in return. And in particular, I think it's challenging because with Trump continuing to talk about, how he might be on the cusp of getting a deal with Xi, how they're going to resolve all of these issues, either very soon at APEC, or maybe they don't actually resolve them all until early next year. It's a very challenging dynamic for a European official or an Australian official who sort of tells me like they don't want to be in the business of they're going to adopt a bunch of export controls and tariffs and investment screening, and then 3 weeks later we take all of ours away, then kind of leaves them in the worst of all worlds, right? And I just hear that very directly now from officials.
Yeah, no, we're probably talking to some of the same people here because we're definitely hearing that as well. I mean, look, it's a very complicated dynamic now, right? So, like, I mean, Peter, as you know well, in the Biden years, we spent kind of a lot of time going out to allies and sort of asking them politely to do a lot of these things. I think, frankly, with sort of minimal success, some success, but not as much maybe as we kind of would have wanted to see. And I think, it has changed now. It's changed both, as you were saying, because other countries sort of see the China threat in a different way now. I think that is palpable. We were over in Brussels a few weeks ago, and there's sort of very different dynamics there than happened before. But obviously, it's also changed because the Trump administration approach is very different here. And the kind of leverage the Trump administration has to make asks is very different than what they're doing. But the question remains sort of, kind of what is the Trump administration actually going to give up in these? I think a lot of foreign governments was viewing kind of cooperation on economic security on a kind of counter-China push as a kind of, olive leaf they could hand over to the Trump administration, sort of, something they could trade away to get, better deals, better kind of market access, what it was. And now it's this question of like, well, does the Trump administration care about this, right? And sort of like, there's always this question of sort of, I think the United States position has long been, Europe, you shouldn't be kind of getting tough on China as a kind of concession to the United States. You should be doing it for your own reasons. I think, frankly, there's a lot of good reason behind that argument. But this question of, on the one hand, is the United States going to start kind of cozying up to China and say, yes, we're going to welcome in $1 trillion of Chinese investment and kind of global export controls and whatever else may be. And that's a kind of real, near-term question I think all these governments are focusing with. There's a sort of separate, sort of broader, more existential question almost, which is that, part of this cooperation on economic security is sort of saying, look, we are in a kind of long-term security partnership. You can trust the United States as a reliable partner. We are the sort of like-minded groups, and we should be kind of working together, in coordination against kind of China and Russia and other authoritarian powers. And I think like that very high-level question is sort of up for debate right now. And certainly, talking to maybe Canadian counterparts in particular, they are kind of having these big existential questions of like, well, we've put our lot in with the United States for sort of our entire history, but to what extent do we need to be rethinking that? And if we're rethinking that, why is now the time that we'd sort of be, strengthening security cooperation with this, potential adversary on our border here?
Yeah, I think there's a universe where you see more implementation of foreign countries implementing economic security programs, but for very different reasons than what we've been talking about, right? Like I don't think that, at least now, it's questionable whether there's like a trade there with the US, but I do think that a lot of foreign governments are just looking for any positive area of cooperation where strategic interests align with the United States and they can point to positive cooperation, even if they're not getting paid for it, quote unquote, like in terms of lower tariffs. Like, so it may not be a trade space, but it's more like, look, all is not lost. Like we can cooperate over here and that still matters. And it aligns with their interest, right? So I think that's a potential. There's also like another world where like everybody just puts up the economic security barriers because they are worried about China and they are worried about the United States. And like we have a very clear example of that from the first Trump administration, which is the EU's anti-coercion instrument, which in the Biden years we like conveniently forgot was about both the United States and China. It was great when we were friends that they had that instrument, and now we should question that, right? But like I think there's this universe where like you do see this kind of building of parallel systems, and like at what point does that actually come back to bite the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the logic driving a lot of governments may now just be sort of like the world's kind of a nastier, kind of harder place to be in right now. Like the global economy is just like more difficult now than it was whatever, sort of 10, 15 years ago. And you need to sort of build in your defensive toolkit and your sort of institutional capacity to exist in that world, whether or not that's the kind of concessions in the United States.
Well, let's be in an optimistic world. Let's try and get. I like Emily. You try to get us back to optimism from time. I'll try. Let's get us back from to optimism. So let's posit though that the Trump administration is is sincerely willing to put some things on the table to get economic security cooperation. Let's also posit that at least a couple of our allies and partners, would like to do this with us as opposed to against us. I actually think that is broadly true. Clearly, one of the geographic regions where this would be, have the greatest potential is here in North America. And if we can get over Trump's kind of on again, off again spats with the Canadians, clearly have a very integrated economy. We clearly share common challenges from China. There is clearly some willingness on the part of the Canadian and the Mexican governments to take action to address some of those challenges. And we've seen both Canada and Mexico raise some tariffs of their own on China over the course of the last year. And just as a raw leverage reality, the U.S. does have a lot of leverage in those negotiations. So we can both give a lot, but we can also try to extract a lot. So it does seem to me that North America with the USMCA renegotiation would be a prime vehicle to try some of this out in practice. And I'd be interested in kind of how, I know you guys, in addition to thinking about this set of issues, have also begun doing some serious work on the USMCA review and potential changes next year. And sort of how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we totally agree that is like the very real near-term opportunity. In addition to everything that you said, Peter, there's a couple other reasons why I think it's so promising. Like one, it is actually a real trade agreement. Like this is not the political handshake deal. Like this is actually a trade agreement that was trumpeted by Trump in the first administration as the biggest, best deal ever. And like in a lot of ways, that's kind of true. Like it set new standards on things like digital trade and modernized the trade agreement and tried some new stuff with, enforcing labor commitments. Like there was a lot of creativity that went into the first USMCA. So it's a real trade deal, and that matters quite a bit. I also think there's just like some very practical problems that taking this approach can solve in the North American context. Like we've been looking at, for example, kind of how many companies, particularly in the electronic sector or in the kind of data center server sector, have moved production away from China into Mexico as part of their de-risking strategy. And so when you think about that, like there's actually a huge case to make sure that we've got kind of comparable leveled up economic security measures to make sure that manufacturing base in Mexico is secure, to make sure that chips that are going into Mexico for assembly into servers that then come into the US to help with our AI data center infrastructure build out, to make sure that's secure, to make sure there's no diversion. Like there's just a very kind of practical problem that this set of solutions can solve in the USMCA context. And then I also think it's possible that like if you're able to bake it into USMCA, and there's all sorts of political questions that are specific to North America that we can and should get into, but if you can bake it into USMCA, then that becomes again the new gold standard, right, for the US and potentially for others. So for a lot of reasons, both specific to North America and also just because this is the opportunity we have first up in line, I think there's a lot of reason to put some real analytic thought and muscle behind this question right now.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that. So, it's worth noting kind of when USTR put out its official request for comments as part of the USMCA review process, which is ongoing now, I think for another couple of weeks or so, it explicitly says we want comments on strengthening cooperation on economic security between the three partners. So clearly, sort of, USTR and Jameson Greer are kind of thinking about these issues in this context. And, maybe one area where I think there's a kind of very obvious potential input here is investment screening in Mexico. So again, Mexico is a country that does not have a CFIUS-like program, has been sort of thinking for quite some time on developing one, certainly in the last administration. Then Secretary Yellen kind of went down to Mexico, and there was a big trip where they sort of did a bunch of preparatory cooperation work. So the United States has been involved on some of that sort of assistance to Mexico in standing up their own regime for some time. But I think it's clear it sort of makes sense to tie that priority into USMCA. Again, we're not talking about here a system where you'd have a kind of USMCA-wide integrated investment screening program, but you would put in USMCA a commitment by all three parties to maintain, domestic investment screening rules. And the point here again is to sort of tie it into a broader political commitment that the Mexicans are making as part of this trade agreement, which then gives the United States and Canada, frankly, a bit of leverage to sort of hold Mexico to that commitment down the line. So I think, that's the type of thing that I think makes all the sense in the world, and which, frankly, I think at this point, they're sort of, all three parties roughly agree something like that will probably end up in the renegotiation is what I'm seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, for Canada, I think it would be relatively easy to make these sorts of commitments. They already have pretty strong domestic economic security programs. There's already a lot of cooperation that happens behind the scenes with the United States. This would be like relatively easy for them to do. It is a much more difficult question for Mexico because they are building most of these programs. And so as we've thought about kind of the overall deal, like I do think the question of capacity building and kind of working closely with Mexico to get them to stand up a regime that addresses our interests and solve some of our own security problems, like that has to be, I think, part of the conversation. And I do think there is interest in, like we've been calling it like the fortress, and others have been calling it kind of this fortress USMCA approach of like kind of how do you build that integrated North American market with that kind of common tariff wall, kind of security wall against certain economic engagement with China. But kind of going back to what we were saying before about how do you structure kind of a joint tariff approach in these sorts of agreements, like one thing we are hearing quite clearly is like, we got to figure out the 232s, right? Like it doesn't make sense for Canada and Mexico to make the political commitment to kind of embrace the United States more fully with a Fortress USMCA approach if they're just going to get whacked with more 232s that actually cover like a vast majority of the trade with the US. So we got to figure that piece of it out. And then the other small problem, let's figure out the 232s. But moving on, the other small problem that we need to address is Chinese retaliation. Because, I mean, particularly I think for Mexico, they're like, look, if we do this, we are going to get whacked. How are you going to help us when we get the retaliation from China, which is, as we talked about before, just like a concern that is bigger and bigger in other countries' minds right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just briefly say, big concern in Canada as well, right? So like once Canada did the EV tariffs, sort of China came in with big tariffs on canola. And again, from what I understand, the kind of Chinese are very explicitly going to the Canadians now and saying, we are punishing you for these tariffs. We knew you did these tariffs basically to sort of be in line with the United States. Meanwhile, the United States is sort of turning around and whacking you with more tariffs. Why don't you give that up and kind of come over to our camp and like, here's the, bag of goodies we can offer you if you'll sort of, take off some of this kind of anti-China posturing. And the real question the Canadian government is going to have to face is like, well, what's the counteroffer from the United States here? At the moment, it's just more tariffs.
Yeah, and I think the Canadian, I hear the same thing from the Canadian government. Now, I think looking at Canada, they understand that both their economy is more dependent on ours than on China. And they also understand that from a kind of a values and geopolitics side, this isn't just transactionalism for them. Like they have more of an interest with us and with the Chinese, but it still nonetheless comes through very loud and clear that if we are going to simply tariff more and more Canadian goods, they are going to have to find other outlets. And that doesn't mean free and open trade with China, but it does mean relatively more trade with China. And so, they'll not sort of fully defect to the Chinese camp, but they are going to become, I worry, much more hedged. And then to your point, Emily, I agree. I think there's there's this trust deficit right now that is particularly keenly felt in North America, because there is this view on the part of many of the Canadians and Mexicans, well, we did this deal just in 2020, right? It was Trump's deal. We just did it 4 years ago. We were also, along with China, the first set of countries he actually tariffed when he comes back into office. And so I think there is also just like a particularly sharply felt trust deficit in both Mexico City and in Ottawa right now that is even more kind of serious than it is in Brussels or Tokyo or Seoul.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how I would rack and stack it with Brussels, but I agree that it is. I mean, it's something we hear in every single conversation, first, last, throughout, right? Like the trust question. And so I think there's this question of, like, if the administration wants to seize this fortress USMCA approach, and like they have a really good opportunity to do it, right? Like that sort of approach could be transformational in terms of how we think about de-risking and kind of really shifting the global economic order to kind of a better de-risk shape for US interests, right? Like that's the opportunity that we should be seizing right now. But to get there, like the US is going to have to, I think, demonstrate that it's worth it. So what does that look like, right? Like what does a credible US commitment to a North American market look like? And I do think, like, I think it's kind of unavoidable. Like it starts with the 232s, and like the president's going to say what the president's going to say. He's going to post what he's going to post, right? But like, how do you actually get at the kind of the question of like, if Canada and Mexico sign up to this, like they're going to get a level of certainty. No, I don't think there's any expectation of like complete safety from any future tariff, right? Like we got a long time left in this term, right? But how do they get enough to make that political bargain worth it, and something they can sell domestically, right? Like they have domestic constituents that they need to worry about. And if you look at the polling, like attitudes of America right now are like sub-toilet levels.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think how you get that credibility is just the $1 million question here. I think it really underlines that, right, like one additional cost of the kind of Trump trade playbook to date is that, by kind of tearing up all the rules and saying we're not going to be bound by anything we signed on to before, we'll kind of, have maximum flexibility to do whatever we want. It makes it very hard to make credible promises about what you will do in the future, right? And so we're at this position where sort of, the Canadians and Mexicans, I think, are both kind of saying, look, we'd be willing to frankly like make big changes, make big sacrifices to kind of go all in on a kind of, Fortress USMCA kind of integrated North America approach. If we could get the true assurances that the United States is in on it, they're not going to kind of turn their back on us, they're not going to do whatever. But the problem is, right, you could like write in to a renegotiated USMCA kind of, double, triple promise that I'm not going to tariff you, but like, what's that going to do for you at this point, right? Like they got those promises the last time around, and they proved to be worth exactly nothing on the Section 232 autos. So it is this sort of foundational question, which is that once you've kind of given up your ability to write, just sort of like, if I just write in the promise, I will do XYZ is no longer seen as credible. Kind of how can you provide some sort of long-term predictability and stability on these issues? Because that's what the United States needs right now.
Yeah, I do think, sort of, if I think sort of traditionally in negotiations, conceivably, in theory, you could see traditional mechanisms like confidence building measures. As we get into this renegotiation, you could see some, small changes from the U.S. on, say, autos and steel in exchange for Canada doing something before the negotiation really gets underway on dairy, or some of the and they don't have to be comprehensive. You could sort of see confidence building measures, which I think, Geoff, to your point, that sort of thing, seeing it in practice would begin to provide some reassurance. But of course, those are the very issues the Trump administration has seen most dug in on. So it's a little hard. I think the Trump administration, if they really want to go down a road, and I think they have really quite a bit of potential to have a Fortress North America type approach here that they could try out. But I think they're going to have to swallow hard and be willing to give a little bit on some of the issues that they are finding hardest kind of internally to be willing to give on.
Yeah. All right. So if we come back in a year, where is all this going to be? Are we going to have 90 economic security agreements in 90 days? What do you think?
A year from now, I'm going to be an optimist. We'll have something meaningful in North America. I am going to be optimistic on that. I also think you just have so much, in addition to kind of the leverage on all sides and the desire, I also think you have so much kind of invested capital across, from our own businesses, that the business pressure is going to be there. I'm going to hazard a guess it's going to be a little bit lighter and more ad hoc elsewhere. Some of that just being a bandwidth issue, right? I mean, like the reality is you cannot, USTR has, Emily, better than a couple hundred people tops, right? They can't do, 90, 100-page trade deals in a year. You literally cannot do it. So they're going to run up on bandwidth constraints, putting aside everything else.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I do think there's going to be at least some elements of this that make it into USMCA. Again, an investment screening measure, sort of something on kind of aligning tariffs on Chinese overcapacity makes sense to me. How much further than that we go? Again, I have this idea of a kind of economic security committee in USMCA that I think would make a lot of sense. I don't know if they're going to be willing to kind of get more ambitious in that type of view. And then, beyond USMCA, right, we'll see. To me, the real question is sort of, do all of the framework agreements out there turn into anything? But which I don't mean, do they turn into kind of big, full multiple 100-page binding trade agreements, but kind of, is there a space as we actually build out what the kind of Japan investment fund in the United States looks like? I think there is kind of scope there to bring a lot of economic security cooperation into those types of frameworks. So that's another area I'll be looking for. But as we said earlier today, all still very TBD.
All still TBD. I think I agree with all of that. I want to be optimistic about North America too, just because I do think it's not out of the question that we have a decent outcome on these issues there. I will say I don't think anything productive is going to happen with the European Union in the next year, in part just because it's always so hard to coordinate these issues with the EU, with the mixed competencies between the Commission and the member state. There's all sorts of reasons why that's going to be super messy and complicated, and we're not even really at the starting line there for the most part. So I'll be pessimistic there, but optimistic. Why not? Let's give it a shot for a change.
Great. Well, that's a good optimistic note for us to end on then.
All right. Thanks, Peter.
No, thank you. This has been great, guys.
Thanks for listening to Derisky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.